All right, this time you've really outdone yourself. History, philosophy, law, economics. We've even got a bit of theology thrown in for good measure.
And it looks like we're about to go on a fascinating journey through it all.
Yeah, it seems like we're going to untangle how these different fields all connect when it comes to religion and political power.
You know, it's really interesting to see these sources highlight how these seemingly separate areas of study are actually connected. We often put knowledge into neat little boxes, but the reality is that it's all linked together.
So we're like interdisciplinary detectives then.
Precisely. And I have a feeling that this idea of political theology is going to be a key clue for us.
That's actually a great point.
Political theology can really help us understand how these religious ideas and symbols have shaped our political and legal systems, even our economic ones. And they're still shaping them today.
So it's not just about rituals and robes and things like that. We're talking about how these abstract theological concepts actually have real-world implications.
Exactly. To really see this in action, let's rewind the clock. Let's go back to medieval Europe. Imagine a world where the Roman Empire has just collapsed and there's this power vacuum.
Okay, I'm picturing knights, castles,
Yeah.
maybe a dragon or two.
Now picture this. In steps the church. Not just to offer spiritual guidance, but to provide a model for structure and legitimacy.
So it's kind of like back then, your local priest was also responsible for collecting taxes and settling disputes.
That's a great way to put it. That line between religious authority and secular authority was incredibly blurry.
So this fusion of power, it had a huge impact then, right?
Absolutely, a profound impact on everything. The legal system, economic practices, even things like the church's views on usury, charging interest on loans had an influence on how credit and banking developed.
So theological ideas were influencing things like the flow of money.
Exactly. And that leads us to a very important figure we'll be looking at, Ernst Kantorowicz. He argued that this fusion of religious and secular authority was perfectly captured by the medieval concept of the king's two bodies.
Okay, hold on. Two bodies. Did medieval kings have a twin or something?
Not quite. The king's two bodies basically means that the king had a physical body that was mortal, of course, and a spiritual body that represented the eternal institution of the crown.
I see. So it's like the king gets sick, the king dies, but the crown lives on.
You got it. The physical body could die, but the spiritual body, the embodiment of the kingdom, would endure.
So this is how they separated the person from the office.
Precisely. That separation, it had huge implications. It allowed for the continuity of power, even as individual rulers changed. And it also really helped legitimize the king's authority, because he was seen as representing something bigger and more enduring than just himself.
Wow, this is starting to sound a lot less like medieval history and a lot more like the foundation for our modern political systems.
It is. Kantorowicz argues that the king's two bodies really helped pave the way for how the modern nation-state developed. This whole shift in thinking, from a personal, divinely ordained authority to a more abstract concept of power held by institutions. It's vital for understanding how political theology still affects us today.
Okay, my mind is officially blown, but I'm still trying to wrap my head around how we get from this abstract theological concept to something as concrete as, economics.
Well, remember how we talked about the church's views on usury and how that influenced those early banking practices?
Yeah.
That's just one example. The king's two bodies also played a role in shaping economic thought. As that concept of a separate, enduring body politic developed, it opened up new ways of thinking about things like public finance, taxation, and the role of the state in regulating economic activity.
So what we're seeing here is that a theological idea could have this ripple effect outward. It's influencing political structures and economic systems.
You got it. And this is where things get even more interesting. As towns grew and trade flourished, you had new power structures emerging. Guilds, universities, and city-states began to challenge the traditional authority of the church and the nobility.
Sounds like the old order was starting to crumble.
It was a definite power struggle. And at the heart of it all was the question of who controlled the resources, specifically money.
Follow the money.
Exactly. The rise of a money economy and those new forms of credit and finance that came with it, they made the relationship between church and state even more complicated. Both sides wanted control over these new forms of wealth, and that led to a lot of heated legal and philosophical debates. Debates that would really have a lasting impact on Western thought.
Wait a second. Are you saying that these medieval economic arguments actually helped shape modern law and philosophy as we know it?
Absolutely. These conflicts forced people to think about some really fundamental questions, like what is the nature of power? What is the relationship between the individual and the state? And what is the role of religion in public life? And those are questions we are still wrestling with today.
I'm starting to see the bigger picture now.
Yeah.
We've gone from these medieval kings with two bodies to this rise of a money economy. And somehow it all ties back to this idea of political theology.
It's all connected. And as we delve deeper into these sources, we're going to see how the legacy of political theology continues to shape our world in ways we may not even realize.
Okay, I'm hooked. Take it away.
So as we start to move a little closer to our own time, I think it's important to remember that these ideas about the king's two bodies and the fusion of religious and secular power, they didn't just disappear.
Right.
They evolved.
Like a chameleon.
Exactly. Think about how we still talk about the body politic when we're talking about the nation state.
Yeah.
We talk about the health of the economy
Oh, that's interesting.
or the soul of a nation. These metaphors suggest a deep connection between our political systems and this idea of a collective body with both temporal and spiritual dimensions.
So even though we think we live in this secular world, these echoes of political theology are still very much present.
Absolutely. And this leads us to the work of more modern philosophers like John Rawls and Charles Taylor, who've really wrestled with this complex relationship between religion and politics in our liberal democracies.
Okay, so remind me about Rawls. He's a big name in political philosophy.
He is.
But how does he fit into this conversation about political theology?
Well, Rawls recognized that in a diverse society like ours, people have a wide range of beliefs, religious, philosophical, and political.
Right, yeah.
He called these comprehensive doctrines.
Apprehensive doctrines.
And he argued that for a liberal democracy to actually function fairly, it needs to operate based on principles that everyone can reasonably accept, no matter what their comprehensive doctrine is.
So it's kind of like finding that common ground, a set of rules that we can all agree on, even if we have different really fundamental beliefs.
Exactly. Rawls called this common ground public reason. It's the idea that when we're debating laws or policies, we should be using arguments that everyone can understand and evaluate. Even people who don't necessarily share our specific religious or philosophical views.
That makes sense, but doesn't that sort of limit the role that religion can play in public life?
It's a valid concern, and it's one that Charles Taylor picks up on in his work.
Okay.
He agrees that, yeah, we need some shared ground rules for how we talk about these things in public, but he worries that Rawls' approach maybe goes a bit too far in excluding those religious voices.
So Taylor's offering a more inclusive perspective then.
Exactly. Taylor argues that secularism shouldn't be about silencing religious perspectives, but rather about creating a public sphere where people of different faiths, or no faith at all, can engage with each other respectfully and meaningfully.
Okay, so it's not about separating church and state so much as it's about figuring out how we can have productive conversations across our differences.
You got it. Taylor thinks a healthy democracy needs to find ways to accommodate the deeply held beliefs of all of its citizens,
Right.
even when those beliefs are rooted in religion.
See, this is where I get a little nervous, though, because how do we balance respecting religious freedom with making sure that everyone feels included and represented, regardless of their beliefs?
It's the million-dollar question.
It is.
And these sources really highlight that there is no easy answer.
Right.
It takes constant dialogue, it takes negotiation, and it takes a willingness to grapple with really complex issues.
Yeah, it sounds like this balancing act is at the heart of so many of our contemporary debates.
It is.
Like arguments around things like same-sex marriage or abortion or even religious exemptions from certain laws.
Exactly.
These are all issues where those deeply held religious beliefs are bumping up against our political and legal systems.
You're absolutely right, and these are prime examples of how that legacy of political theology is still shaping our world today. And understanding this legacy can really help us navigate these really complex and often contentious debates with more nuance and empathy.
Okay, I see how it all fits together now.
You do.
We've gone from those medieval kings with two bodies to the rise of a money economy. And it all links back to this idea of political theology.
It does.
Yeah.
And as we continue to explore how these ideas kind of manifest in the modern world, we're going to see just how important understanding this legacy is for navigating the challenges of the 21st century.
All right, I'm ready when you are. Okay, so we've seen how this body politic idea, with its echoes of the king's two bodies, has really had a lasting impact. But how does this all play out in the world today? I mean, We're not exactly out there crowning monarchs or launching crusades anymore.
True, but the legacy of political theology is much more subtle, much more woven into the fabric of our lives than we might realize. Think about how we talk about notions. They're not just lines on a map or political systems, are they? They're imbued with this soul, this spirit, something that goes beyond just the individual citizens and evokes this really deep emotional response.
So you're talking about patriotism.
Exactly. That sense of belonging, the loyalty, even that willingness to sacrifice for your country. And the way that national identity is often expressed through symbols and rituals, even language, it reveals that lasting influence of political theology.
So we're talking about things like...
Flags, anthems, national holidays, those war memorials,
Right.
they all carry this sense of sacredness, a connection to something bigger than ourselves.
So it's almost like those medieval ideas about the king and the realm being one have been kind of secularized and transferred to the modern nation state.
You got it. And the secularization doesn't mean that religion has just vanished from public life. It's taken on new forms, new ways of interacting with power. We see this in all those debates about religious freedom, secularism, and the role of faith in politics.
And those debates can get really heated. How do we even begin to navigate these complex issues in a way that respects all these different perspectives?
It's a tough one. Remember Rawls and Taylor?
Yeah.
They offer some useful frameworks for thinking about this. Rawls really emphasized the importance of public reason. The idea that when we're having these discussions in the public square, we should be using arguments that everyone can understand and get behind, regardless of their religious beliefs.
So basically, in the public square, we should stick to shared values and logic rather than leaning on specific religious doctrines.
You got it. Taylor, on the other hand, cautions against completely excluding religious voices from the public sphere. He argues for a more inclusive approach where we recognize that for a lot of people, their religious beliefs are fundamentally intertwined with their moral and political values.
So it's about finding that balance, right? We don't want to impose a strict separation of church and state, but we also need to make sure that everyone feels like they belong and their views are respected.
Exactly. It's a conversation that's constantly evolving, and I think these sources really remind us that navigating this terrain requires us to be thoughtful, empathetic, and willing to really engage with viewpoints that might be different from our own.
It definitely feels like we've only just scratched the surface here. From medieval kings with two bodies to modern debates about national identity and secularism, this has been quite the deep dive.
That's what makes it so fascinating, right? This deep dive has given us a new way to understand how these seemingly disparate pieces all fit together. It's challenged us to really think critically about the influence of political theology on our world.
It certainly has.
Yeah.
You know, after all this, I don't think I'm ever going to look at a flag or a national holiday the same way again.
That's what we were going for. This conversation is just the beginning. It's an open door to keep exploring, to keep asking questions, to keep grappling with these ideas because they're complex and they're fascinating. As we've seen, this interplay between religion and power is a story that's still being written, a story that we're all a part of.
Well, I want to thank you for guiding us through this incredible journey through history, philosophy, and political thought. It's definitely been eye-opening.
You're very welcome.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.